Hello and welcome to another episode of TED-IELTS. I'm David Wills, and today we're going to be looking at the IELTS writing task 1. And in particular, we're going to examine a line graph and look at how we could describe it. I want to take you through the process of describing a line graph, and then I'm going to show you my sample answer, and we'll talk about how I came to that. And hopefully this can help you in figuring out the correct process for doing IELTS writing task 1. Before we begin today's lesson, I'm just going to take a moment to remind you about my book. It's called Grammar for IELTS Writing, and it contains 10 chapters that guide you through all the most important things you need to know about producing a high-quality IELTS writing exam paper. So, how much does it cost? Is it $5, $10, $20? No, it is absolutely free. I'm going to put the link down below. If you enjoy it, give it a share on social media, on your Facebook, your Twitter, your blog, whatever. So here you can see the question and the line graph, and this is pretty much how it would appear on the actual IELTS exam. You can see the first line you should spend about 20 minutes on this task, and the last one you should write at least 150 words. These are standard, they pretty much always appear in those positions, in those exact words at this part of the exam. In the middle though, the information changes. The graph below compares the number of visits to 2 new music sites on the web. So this is going to be different for every task 1 essay that you encounter. And it's going to essentially summarize the information in the most basic way possible. You have to pay attention to this line because it can be really useful to try and paraphrase it in your own introduction, and it's a great key to actually understanding the data. This line graph that I've chosen is a really basic one. I think it's quite simple to understand, and it's really easy to write a good description of because there's so much information that you can use. That's why I've picked it. We can look at a more difficult one sometime in the future, but I think this is a good introduction. When you're looking at a line graph like this, you should be paying attention to the title. That is usually at the top of the graph, but sometimes you'll see it at the bottom. And here the title is actually very similar to the question or the statement in the question. Sometimes you'll see it's different and you have to take the information from both and try and figure out the overall meaning. But in this case, it's pretty simple. Visits to 2 new music sites on the web. Web, of course, meaning internet. You then have to look at the vertical axis. That's the one going up and down on the left. And there might be 2, sometimes there's another vertical axis, and also the horizontal axis going along the bottom. In the case of a line graph, this is usually going to be time, hours, days, weeks, months, years, and so on. You also need to be looking at, for the vertical axis, what the units are. And here, pay attention that this is not 20, 40, 60, it's 20,000, 40,000, 60,000, and so on. You also need to look at the legend or key that tells you the information about the data. In this case, it says the blue line represents one website, the red line is another one. And then we look at the actual data in the middle. So in this line graph, what would we want to look at? Well, you should always be looking for general trends and big significant differences between the 2 lines and differences in a single line over time. So the general trend, well, when I look at this, I see the blue line started lower than it finished, and so did the red line. And yet along the way they both fluctuated. That means to go up and down. So my explanation of the general trend is that they both finished higher than they started, but that they fluctuated significantly along the way. I would pay attention as well to significant differences. At the beginning, we can see there's a major difference between Music Choice and Pop Parade. And at the end, it is less so, but there's still a big difference between them. I would look at this jump in the number of visitors to Music Choice, and also this jump here in the number of visitors to Pop Parade. I think it's interesting that Pop Parade declines for a long time, then it rapidly grows in popularity, then it falls, then it grows again. Whereas Music Choice, after an initial fluctuation, it stays relatively flat until about day 11, whereafter it suddenly increases, maintains a high level, and then falls. And the final thing that I think is interesting here is that for 2 days, the 12th and 13th day, Music Choice is actually more popular than Pop Parade, but these are the only days. So these are the things I would want to discuss just by looking at this. Then you need, of course, to think, how are you going to structure this essay? Well, for the IELTS writing task 1, I would always suggest writing an introduction followed by 2 body paragraphs. You don't need to write a conclusion, because anything that you would say in summary that would normally go in a conclusion can be included in the introduction. Then the body paragraphs, I would suggest one you write about the red line and then the other about the blue line. However, there are other ways to do it. You could divide the first paragraph into the first half of the graph and the second paragraph into the second half of the graph. But when you've got 2 lines, to me it makes more sense to take 1 paragraph for 1 line and 1 paragraph for another line. Let's look then down to the actual essay I've written here. And we'll start off with the introduction as it stands here. So my introductory sentence, that's the very first sentence here, says the line graph shows the number of visitors to 2 new websites over a period of 15 days. So this is basically paraphrasing the question here, the number of visits to 2 new music sites on the web, which is also very similar to the title of the graph. However, you'll notice I use the word websites, where I've taken sites and web to put them together. Remember, it's very important in this type of essay that you use your own words and don't repeat the question. Another important point to note, never copy the word below, because on the exam paper, the question is above and the graph is below. However, you'll be writing on a different piece of paper, so your answer is not above the graph and the graph is not below you. I've also changed graph to line graph because that's more accurate, and it's a good idea in your introduction to mention the time period, which is along the horizontal axis. In this case, there are 15 days, so I've just said over a period of 15 days. My next sentence is my description of the general trend. That means the overall main sort of idea, main features of the line graph. And I explain this in just 1 sentence. Both websites end the period with a higher number of visitors than at the beginning, but there are some extreme fluctuations in between. That's basically what I mentioned to you earlier when I was looking at and describing the graph. I think that is the most obvious thing, and in your introduction you're going to look for that general trend, the obvious thing. You don't need to say any specific details, you don't need to make any major comparisons, just describe the general trend in very simple terms. So you can see my essay here now. I've gone for that structure that I explained, which is introduction and then 2 body paragraphs. My first paragraph, I talk about Pop Parade. I start off with a very general observation, which is that at both the beginning and end of the 15-day period, Pop Parade had a higher number of visitors than Music Choice. You can see that to be true. Pop Parade is higher at the beginning and it is higher at the end. Then it's a good idea to give some statistics here. So to mention some actual numbers, because remember, you're writing a report for a university lecture. You have to imagine that they cannot see the line graph, and you have to give enough specific details that they could imagine it. So I start by mentioning that number. Then I use this phrase, fell at varying rates until the 9th day. Well, what does that mean? Fell at varying rates. Well, here you can see from the first day to the 9th day, it is falling. It begins to fall slowly, it recovers a little, it falls faster, faster still, it recovers a little, and then it falls very fast. Well, I could go through and describe this. I can use it falls slightly, it decreases a little. I could use language like that, but it's a little boring and repetitive. So I just describe the overall trend for those 9 days. Then I mention after which it rose sharply for 2 days, nearly quadrupling before falling by almost half by day 12. So this word here, quadrupling, that is this significant jump. So what does that mean? Well, look at the beginning of this word, quad. In English, quad means 4. So it has risen fourfold is another way of saying that. Think of doubling and tripling. These are words that every IELTS student should know. Quadrupling is much less common, but it's a good word to know. So double, triple, quadruple. It means to increase fourfold. Again, before falling by almost half. So here, instead of saying the actual numbers, I'm using my English abilities to express this. I'm showing I've got a better grasp of the language, quadrupling and falling by almost half. So instead of saying it rises by 60,000 or falls by 10,000, I'm using words to express this. Finally, it ended the period with another steep rise, more than doubling from 8,000 to more than 160,000. So that describes this part here. You can see I've used the actual numbers, 160,000, 8,000, but I've also incorporated this phrase, doubling. So I'm using a good grasp of language to describe exactly through numbers and words what is happening. The next paragraph, I say music choice fluctuated at lower levels than Pop Parade for most of the period. So that's referring to this. So you can see it's fluctuating, it's going up and down, but from day 1 through day 11, it's always lower than Pop Parade. It has fewer visitors than Pop Parade. However, I describe one interesting thing. So that is, on day 3, it experienced a sudden jump in number of visitors before falling back to previous levels. So that's describing this little bump here. Then we get to the interesting part, that is this sentence. On day 11, however, the number of visitors soared from around 25,000 to 100,000 in a single day, which was higher than the daily visitors for Pop Parade. It remained higher than Pop Parade for 2 days before falling back to lower levels, ending its 15-day period at about 70,000 visitors, a little less than double its first day. So a lot of information there. Remained higher than Pop Parade for 2 days. So that's this interesting bit here when Music Choice briefly surpassed Pop Parade in popularity for those 2 days, and then we can see the drop at the end. So we've got useful language here, remained higher than, falling back to, and ending the period at about. And then here we've got this expression, a little less than double its first day. So you can see how I've tried to use language to express the differences and changes instead of just quoting numbers. If you look here, your eye will be drawn to numbers quite quickly. We've got 1, 2, 3, and 4 instances when I use them. Instead, at other places I've been using verbs like to rise, and I've been describing with doubling and quadrupling and falling to half how the numbers have changed, how the number of visits has changed. So I hope this has been helpful for you. I'm going to leave a link to my website below, and you can find my sample essay there. I've got lots of other sample essays at my website. I think it's very useful for students to look at these and see how the language could be used. If you have any questions about this, of course, you can leave them in the comments section below. Please give this video a like if it has been helpful to you. And if you haven't done already, please do subscribe and hit the notification button. All right, I've been David Wills. This is TED-IELTS, and it's a pleasure as always to help you getting a higher IELTS score. I'll see you next week.